So I got to talk to three founders this week in some detail, and two of them are going to fail, which sucks. And one of them almost certainly won't, which is great. And they're all kind of at the same stage doing fairly different things. Two are in software, and then one is in physical commerce of actually food products. Um, and the one in order, the first one that's going to fail, very technical, very software minded, has built a cool product, is in an interesting niche, I think has something. Like there's potential there. And we were talking about a partnership in terms of how to get into the the sales process, and to go ahead and roll this out, right? So to take the current platform they've got, build it out, and bring in some larger paying customers. This is a SaaS product. This would be software as a service. And it's got potential, but the reason I would call that one is going to fail is because the founder is slow and vague. Very technical, has built a great product, spent a while doing this, but when I asked for a demo, it was a long time getting a straight answer back, and I never did get one. So I know the platform is there. I've seen the paying customers use it. I've heard a lot about it, but I'm still unclear on how it works and what it looks like and what it does because I haven't seen a demo. I haven't seen a way behind it. And I got wishy-washy answers on that of like, oh, well, I can customize it for such and such, or I can make it do this and this. But not having any sort of demo documentation for that is the kind of problem that's going to grow very quickly. And not being able to provide that, especially after a long amount of time, is a huge challenge. And if you're going into the sales cycle, if you want to sell this thing, you have to be able to give salespeople something to sell, some level of conversation piece, something to say to prospective customers, like a very basic information about the platform, what it does, what it's supposed to do, and how it works. If that's not something that can be translated, if that's not something that goes into an easy conversation, if that's not something you can sell, it's not going to sell. And that's got issues there, and that's the big problem. It's just very slow. Communication's a little bit strange. So if you have someone running a company and they can't fully articulate what it is or why someone should buy it, you can't do anything with that, right? And that one's especially sad because I think there's a lot of potential there. That one's really cool, but yeah, if you can't articulate the product, if you can't demonstrate the platform, if you can't give someone something to run with from a sales conversation, it's not going anywhere, right? And then that one also was a little bit confusing because of pricing model. There were two competing pricing models being talked about, and they're not compatible necessarily. There was like a subscription service for individual users, but then also large-scale licensing for large commercial customers. There is space there, and the conversation was good enough where it could certainly work, right? But I don't see how it can overcome the initial hurdle of just being, again, vague and slow. And those are kind of death knells for this stuff. Either it doesn't launch, or it takes a long, long time to figure those out, and then we'll launch later. But as of right now, it's at least not ready. The second is arguably more tragic, because we're talking like a functional product, a good product, one that's built right now by hand. Both of those two actually were built by hand that don't actually use AI tools in them at all, which makes it a little bit harder to find funding and investment for, but does mean that they have a certain level of simplicity that's kind of lacking from the market right now. And both are tools that don't need AI to function, so that's cool. So, but the second founder is younger, is ambitious, has a really good, like it's a co-founder relationship where there's two technically minded people, and the one is salesy and social and could certainly sell this. The challenge there is the biggest challenge for them. Like they're at this jumping off point. They're at this moment where they have a product, they have a handful of paying customers, they have a free tier, the stuff is all out there. They can recruit bigger enterprise customers and they could take off any day. But they're founder led. They're bootstrapping, so they don't have funding right now. They don't need a series raise. They don't need that kind of explosive growth of like actually getting investment from like a VC or something. What they need is just enough funding to keep the lights on while they get rolling. They need like two guys' salary for a year or two. Which that's an area where a ton of startups fail, where they have the product, they have paying customers, but it's not enough to support the founding team. And if they don't have a lifeline, they don't have a backbone, or not a backbone. If they don't have a lifeline, if they don't have enough money to pay their bills through the time it takes to get this thing rolling, they're just not going to make it. And that sucks. that level of bridge funding is a really, really big gap for startups, especially technical founders, especially newer founders. Even if they have a great handle of what they're building, they have a great product, there's something there to build with, they will probably never be known about because they just didn't make it past this hump where they don't have the money to actually make the sales. They don't have enough money to get through the sales cycle. Um, and there's an enormous need for that. So your pre-seed, your accelerator programs, I think there's a significant gap in terms of founders who have something. And if there was a team that could just step in and be like, we will do your initial sales for you for a percentage of your profits or something like that, that would get these guys over the hump and be a really huge proving ground to go ahead and get these companies actually up and running to where they actually become successful startups. Because these guys, they have very low overhead. It's just the two guys. They could run this indefinitely as just them. And it's not an intensive, hard to use product. There's a lot of value in it. It works really well. And again, it's very functional. And there are multiple companies on the market right now um, that prove that the model works. But they're doing things that are alienating their customer base. So this is a really ripe time for a competitor. And then also, this is a European-based variant of a US company. So there's a lot of hunger for that in Europe and in some companies elsewhere across the world to have a variant that's just housed somewhere outside the US. So there is a competitive advantage, there's a market advantage, there's an approach to doing what they're doing. They have every single reason to succeed right now. And they might pull it off. But if they don't, it will be because they don't have the funds, they don't have a runway. They don't have the funds to keep the lights on long enough to actually build the thing. Um, and it's really especially tragic in that case because they need so little. You're talking two guys' salaries for like 6 months, and they could get two paying customers and then be good indefinitely from then on. And they could run a sustainable business without VC investment, without explosive growth, without any of that. They could do organic marketing, direct sales outreach, founder-led growth, and continue indefinitely, succeeding really well. And I think the founders would really enjoy that, being able to do that. So I do think there's a big gap there. There's this expectation that a startup is going to become a unicorn. They're going to raise $10 million and then become like 100 million ARR in 6 months. And some will do that, but there's a huge gap where there's so many companies and so many teams that don't need to do that, could meet a need, could build a product that's genuinely useful, that is profitable and sustainable long term, but they don't need to actually do the VC raise to make it happen. There's a gap there, and I really think we need to figure out a way to serve that. Um, and then the final one is a more upbeat story because this is somebody who's already succeeded in terms of it is an independent small business. This is somebody who could continue on doing as they're doing now, grow just a little bit, and then it could become someone's job. But this founder wants to expand it a bit, wants to grow it, wants to make it bigger, wants to go from the kind of like small events, local champions. And this again is the food business. This is the local food business. It is very cool. This is one that could easily just keep on doing what they're doing with like small events and small launches, pre-orders and event-based mailers, and just like have a very comfortable individual living. But this one's an interesting case because again, this is sustainable right now. So the runway is basically indefinite. The growth is kind of as much as they want to grow. And while software companies have the advantage of having like the biggest market out there, you could sell anywhere, physical food companies have this really wonderful human connection, and you can go and literally pick up customers off the street in a way that digital platforms competing for attention can't. So as an individual person making food and then selling it individually and like talking it up as the person making it, that's a very uniquely, I don't want to say easy, it's still a lot of legwork, but it's a uniquely straightforward business model to be like, hey, I have this thing, people like this thing, I have people who buy it now, I'm going to tell you what's great about it, and you can try a sample right here and then maybe buy some or not. That's really cool. So that B2C, like producing local goods for local events thing is an awesome spot to be in. But this is somebody who kind of wants to expand it like a startup. They want to expand more events, bigger events, partnerships, larger scale orders. They want to make this a big thing, not just like a kitchen table science. They want to make this an actual much bigger thing than it is and make this into like an actual legit company. So looking at growing like a startup, a little bit kind of like Yelp grew individual markets. So you look at Yelp as a large scale software platform that launched multiple communities of businesses. you can use the exact community manager, community ambassador model that Yelp did for a local business, and it works really well, especially in a tourist-centric city like Lisbon, where we're based. Um, it's a very cool market for this kind of thing, where you can tap into the tourism market and you can tap into the massive hype machine that is tourists on their social media accounts. But then also you can really feed into that local pride as well, like locally made, locally produced, like a local company. So you can have your sustainable year-round business with your local advocates, and you can dip into that larger tourism market at the larger event spaces if you want to. So that's very cool. So three really different conversations. This is one of my favorite things about what I'm doing right now is I can go ahead and have these conversations with so many different kinds of founders, so many different kinds of companies, all going through these different challenges. And it's really nice to be able to help where I can. So as I'm doing this, I'm kind of taking note of where the gaps are, helping the people who I can help, working directly with the people I can work with, but then also calling out the spots where we really could use some additional support, just kind of as a startup ecosystem, and where we could help make sure that companies like this really get the best chance they could have on like an actual launch. And we think of investment and startup support often just as something like investment, just raw dollars coming in from a VC, or like a loan from a bank. But really, like human services are a really huge part of what's missing. So like having salespeople who are paid, who are on staff, it's like we are salespeople, but we work on contract with a bunch of different startups who are all looking to market out and sell. It's a challenging spot to be in because a salesperson is like a full-time role, and to be a full-time role for multiple businesses is a lot, especially if you don't know which ones are getting traction. But in a case like this, again, where these are really small companies, these are low overhead, these are people who need just one or two big sales to really have the launch they need to do a sort of revenue share type deal where it's like, we're going to work with you for 3 months. We'll take X percentage of your revenue for that time, and then we're going to move on to the next. Like there is definitely a pretty significant sales model there that would really be helpful for these companies, and I'd be curious to see something like that roll out. That's the thought for the day. Hope you all are doing well. Cheers.